Hello, everyone. I am here today with John Prince. Hello, John.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on. So, before I tell you how I met John, and John will tell his story, I have a short statement to my English-speaking listeners. I realized before this recording that this will be my third episode in a row that is in English. And when I first started the podcast last summer, my intent was to bring on mostly Estonian-speaking guests. So my first 3 episodes were indeed in Estonian. Last summer, I also did an introductory episode in Estonian where I briefly introduced myself and the intent of this podcast series. So I will now briefly do the same in English. So my name is Kenneth Yogi, and I am a member of the LDS Church here in Estonia. I joined when I was 20 years old and been in the church for 22 years. Up until a few years ago, I was a true blue Orthodox Mormon, having served in almost all the callings on the local level. I have always been very inquisitive and studied for years topics of LDS Church history and doctrine from the church-friendly and apologetic perspective. So I have been aware of the issues for years, as many these days are. But at some point in my life, I developed a desire to live and study more broadly and authentically. So one topic of interest for me was the life of those who have left the church. I was interested because while I observed a lot of people joining the church and shortly thereafter falling away, I rarely saw anyone coming back or reactivating. At around Christmas 2 years ago, I was given an assignment to give a sacrament meeting talk, and I was a branch mission leader at that time. As I was contemplating what I should give the talk about, I felt an inspiration to take a scientific approach and do a survey among those inactive or former members whom I knew and could contact, and give the talk based on what I would find out via the survey. In summary, what I found out was that while the majority of inactive members had fond memories of their formerly active church experience and did not have hostile feelings towards the church, almost all of them were happy in their current circumstance and were not contemplating returning. Many were not interested or happy about active members trying to activate them. This finding changed the way I thought about effective reactivation. I also realized how much I had learned by not just assuming, but actually sincerely approaching a subject to whom it actually pertained. This led me to open up to a much broader approach to studying religion, which has led me to doing this podcast. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about John. So I'll give a brief biography of John. So John, you're now 44 years old, correct? You grew up in Houston, Texas. You served a mission to Scotland. You earned a PhD in molecular biology, and you became an assistant professor at Brigham Youngi University in 2010. And you left employment with BYU in 2014. So I have a missing piece here. So where do you live currently, and what do you do currently for work?
Yeah, we still live in Provo, Utah, in the same house that we bought when we moved here so that I could work at BYU. And I currently am a platform engineer at Owlet, baby care. So they do the little sock baby monitors and cameras and things like that.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So just kind of dive in, I guess. And
yeah.
What we'll do. Yeah. So.
Is there anything you want to say about your family?
Yeah, so I'm married to a wonderful person. My wife is Melissa Snow, and we have 6 children. Our oldest 2 are at UVU, and we have 2 who are in elementary school and 1 in middle school, 1 in high school. A lot of children, and which is great. And yeah, so and I think that some of the family dynamics will be woven into, I guess, the story of my relationship with the LDS Church and how that evolved over time. And yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, go ahead and just talk about growing up in the church, how you experienced the church in your youth, and about your mission, maybe, if you want to talk about it, and just let's say give your biography as it relates to the church.
Perfect. Excellent. Yeah. So I think it's useful to understand my parents. My mother was a convert to the church at the age of 19, I think. Oh gosh, now so she was young. My father was descended from handcart pioneers and other pioneers. His grandparents and ancestors had settled in the St. George area, and so they had always been very strong in the church. My parents met in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They ended up with my father's family moving to Houston, Texas. And in Houston, my father's family was very influential in building the church, especially like on the west side of Houston. And so some of your listeners will be familiar with John Dehlin. He's kind of one of the most famous Mormons and former Mormons around. And so he often speaks, in very positive terms about his time growing up in the church. And this was in the same area as where we lived and where my family lived. So he was associating with my grandparents and my uncles and my cousins. And so we knew his family. They didn't live exactly right next to us, but they lived near all of our cousins and uncles. We lived slightly further away in a different area of Houston, but it was still pretty close, same state generally. And so it was, so the church was, so our family, the Prince family, was tied very deeply into the LDS tradition and growing the church in that area. And for me personally, it was a great upbringing. I guess I don't really have any complaints about my youth in the church, especially growing up. I think that you feel like you're part of a greater organization. I still remember going to the church and like watching BYU football on satellite. They would broadcast it into the church, and that was just those types of activities, the basketball and the events and doing all those types of things. You just felt like you were part of a much bigger operation, and it always felt like our family was integral to that. So most of my uncles or many of my uncles and my grandfather, they had been bishop of different wards in that area and always in kind of high leadership. And so I was from a family of 9 children. That's a very Mormon way of being and a Mormon way of living. I really loved that. Some people resent being from a large family. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed having siblings around. I thought it was really special. Anytime somebody would, I would always, I think I embarrassed my mother because I would always just raise the point that, like, we have 9 children. There are 9 children in our family. And I would let everybody know this because I was so, to me, it was just a point of great pride. And this was wonderful. And I couldn't understand why anybody wouldn't be, ecstatic about this. And I think, so.
What number were you in the sequence?
So I was fourth of 9. And so, and so, as it pertains to the church, I think the big dynamic that happened there is that my uncle, who lived in Katy, Texas, he was part of the state presidency there at the time. He was essentially trying to rescue his oldest daughter, who had been studying Mormonism and had basically fallen away from it. I was just thinking, though, the term that we use is so interesting, where we talk about a fall away from the church, because when you're going through it, it doesn't necessarily seem like a fall. It seems like a discovery of additional ways of looking at these things. You're not necessarily falling, you're exploring and understanding more and making new sense of the world. And so I think this is what had happened to my cousin. Anyway, my uncle tried to save her, to show her that these things were wrong. This was mostly, I think it was mostly the Tanner, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, their literature that they had written. And as he dug into it, he realized that a lot of these claims that they were making were very powerful, and that there weren't great answers to many of these. And so he left the church over a period of time. There's a Mormon Stories episode where he gives his story. So, I won't go into any of that. And my closest cousin was in that family as well. And so just around that time, our family ended up moving to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And our family narrative was that we were, that this was essentially a blessing because it allowed us to escape the proximity to our uncle's family, because we were such good friends with them. But by my father losing his job and us having to move to a different place, this was the kind of the Lord's way of protecting us from these influences that would have just pulled us away from the gospel. And so our family narrative at that time was that this was a great blessing to us to move to Louisiana. We eventually moved back to Texas. I think, so especially living outside of Utah, your identity is so interrelated to the church. And so, you view yourself in those terms. Your closest friends are LDS, and and even when you have friends who are not LDS, there's still kind of a push either, well, you should be kind of converting them, or you need to keep your distance because they're likely to be a bad influence in some way, right? They're going to try and get you to have sex, or they're going to try and get you to drink alcohol or do drugs, or something that you just need to be cautious around especially your non-member friends. I think, like most teenagers, I struggled with different aspects of the faith. Certain things don't necessarily add up very well, and I think that I felt like that there were some strong points that say, like, the atheists had made, and so I struggled with aspects of being LDS as I approached my mission. But even at the same time, I was still very pro LDS. At that time, one of my good friends, we baptized. I helped in her conversion process, so she joined the church. And anyway, so I eventually made it onto my mission. And in the MTC, I had like a strong conversion experience where I felt, powerful spiritual feelings. And I said this, I identified those as the Holy Ghost, and decided that this meant definitively that the things that I had heard about my entire life were true. And at that point, I'd been 1 year to BYU, and that hadn't actually been a great experience for me in many ways. And so it was, I had been pretty depressed and pretty despondent, because it didn't feel, my path wasn't really clear. And being in tension with the faith that you grew up with, and with your family and with expectations, I think that creates, or can create depression and anxiety. And so having that conversion experience, it's something, you're in the MTC, and I think at that point you're very susceptible to being in a position where you want so badly for this to be true, so that any of it can make sense, and your life can make sense. And also, as you're thinking about what a 2-year mission is going to look like, it sounds like the worst kind of hell to be preaching something for 2 years in a foreign country, and not to actually believe it. And so you're extremely motivated to embrace those, to embrace that truth. And so,
but John, I think we will absolutely take that as a separate topic of what the spiritual experiences are, and what they could alternatively be interpreted as. But at this point, would you be willing to describe your conversion experience in a little more detail, like what you actually experienced?
Yeah. So in this case, I would say like the strong kind of conversion or spiritual experience that I had was, it was several days into the MTC experience. I've been praying. Of course, I mean, the MTC is you're praying and reading and teaching and doing all those things continually, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep. But it was at night, I was praying intensely, and I just, felt the overwhelming feeling of just peace and joy. And it was very powerful. It was like, it was dialed up to 10 or 11, it was just, very, very strong, and it persisted for a period of maybe 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. So it was that type of experience. And I think, so that was very convincing to me at the time. But then at the same time, as once I sort of altered my perspective, then I would say, I persistently had those feelings of, peace and joy. And a lot of this I attribute to being in resonance with kind of the expectations that I had, and also with this idea that, hey, I could, I had so much anxiety. Can I do a mission, and what's that going to look like? And, once you feel like, okay, it is true, well, that means everything's going to be okay. And that means I can preach this and with sincerity, and I can be a powerful missionary, and I can, and I can help convert people, and the Spirit will help me. And I don't even have to convert anybody, because the Spirit will do the work, because it's real. And so for me, it was that kind of experience. But I would say it wasn't just the single experience. I think for me, what was so convincing over time of the kind of the truth of the church was that I could duplicate this experience, maybe to a lesser intensity, but just perpetually, right? Like I would say, almost every day of my mission, I felt the Spirit. I felt those feelings of peace and love and joy as I was helping and teaching and talking about Joseph Smith and talking about the Book of Mormon and reading the Book of Mormon, like all these things, so for me, it wasn't just a single, powerful experience. I had that, that was part of it, but it was this just perpetual experience. And really that persisted. I had those experiences for since then for 20 years. So it was, for me, it was, before my actual faith transition, which I'll get to in a little bit. I guess I felt like I had such persistent experience with the testimony of the Spirit, the power of the Spirit, and that was very, very convincing to me, just generally. So my mission. The other thing probably worth mentioning on my mission, because it became a part of my narrative with the church, is that our mission was very doctrinally oriented. Two mission presidents before my mission president, or one or two, had been Joseph Fielding McConkie, and he had been very focused. This is the son of Bruce R. McConkie. He was a religion professor at BYU. He's a very orthodox believer and in general in his views. And so there was a pattern in our mission of just being extremely doctrinal. So we had a whole book of scripture that we would all write in, and we had to memorize. We memorized just pages and pages and pages, like the whole, the beginning of Alma 13, this very dense, very difficult discussion on the priesthood and Melchizedek and the pre-existence and all of this. And, part of, we would memorize all, it's like maybe 13 or 14 verses. So pages of some of the most dense scripture were part of what we did. We memorized all the discussions. It was so in our, and then the other thing is that our mission was, some different missions have different relationships with different LDS literature. In our mission, it was everybody was reading everything. So we were reading, our mission president gifted us Mormon doctrine for Christmas as an example. We were reading the book Mormon Doctrine on our mission, which, so some more, so the church has a complex relationship with that, but we were,
authored by Bruce R. McConkie.
Bruce R. McConkie, that's right. But it represented one very conservative strand of viewing Mormon doctrine, but our mission president was in this view. But as an example, our assistants, I just remember, like, people would quote the seer, Orson Pratt's The Seer, during our zone conferences and things like this. Like, this was common, that people were talking about all these deep doctrines. We were reading church books, and we were reading also other books. We were reading, we were reading creationist literature and things like this. And this is something. So I'd like to go back to this at some point, because so there's a lot of different threads. So in I think a faith transition and in my faith journey. And so, and it's hard to decide where to tease those out and apart. But anyway, so I had a great mission experience. Generally, I loved it. I felt fully converted. I was, just kind of a gung-ho missionary. And then, so I went back to BYU. I finished a degree in microbiology, and then decided that I didn't have any employable skills at this point. And so graduate school was the only course for me. So I married my wife while I was at BYU. We had our first child. I went to the University of Texas, and I started a program in molecular biology with kind of an emphasis in bioinformatics and systems biology, which is a kind of approaching biological systems, cellular systems, and organisms in a comprehensive way, instead of just focusing on just bits and pieces here and there. And so it was very computationally intense, and that was awesome. I really loved it.
How was it studying that as an active LDS? person.
Yeah, and maybe it's okay to talk about this thread because I think it was interesting. It was good, but this goes back. So there's the church's relationship with evolution is rocky, and I experienced this firsthand during my conversion during high school and all of this. So I grew up in a conservative home. My mom would say things like, well, why are there dinosaur bones? Well, maybe they came from chunks of other planets, right? Like maybe the Earth was created from other chunks.
The most obvious scenario.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Like, so because why is because, well, Adam and Eve, they, this and God created the earth in the way that the Bible, and we have all these other creation stories in the book of Moses and the book of Abraham and the temple. Like this was the pattern. And so, dinosaurs aren't mentioned, where did they come from? Why are they, and what do you do with cavemen and what do you do with evolution? And so we were, they never got into any specifics, but you kind of had a general feeling that evolution wasn't really right. And there were other explanations, the gospel story being the correct message. When I went to BYU my first year, I was a microbiology major. And when you take all of the different classes, you are, the biology classes, you are inundated with all of the data and the perspectives that support evolution and that narrative. And you're being taught it by BYU professors who are ostensibly believing, temple recommend holding members who just seem like wonderful people. And so it doesn't take long if you're a biology major, a microbiology major, to say, well, of course evolution is true. I'm not exactly sure how that fits in with the gospel. It's fuzzy, but that's okay. At least in the biology departments, we know that evolution is true. Like there's no discussion. Well, there is discussion, sorry, but the evidences are so clear and so persistent and so just effusive. It's everything you study is integrated into with evolutionary thought, and it's just really difficult to tease apart any of biology from evolution at a molecular level and an organismal ecosystems. It's all tied into evolutionary theory.
That's right. So I was just going to mention that I guess for people who don't understand or don't believe in evolution, even if BYU is a church school, I mean, if they want to teach biology, they have to teach evolution. I mean, it's the only game in town, so to speak, right?
Yeah, it's the only academic game for sure. And so, but it wasn't, so people, I think, talk about BYU's relationship with evolution in those terms right there. It's like, well, they have to be accredited. It has to be that way. But what you experience when you're there and with these different professors in that department is, it is not reluctantly taught. It is fully embraced by anybody who studies biology in any depth. Firmly believes in evolution. They embrace it. They, appreciate it. They love it. It's, and so it's not reluctant at all in the among anyone who studies biology academically. And so and there's attempts to integrate that into the religious framework and doctrines, and maybe I can get to that in a little bit, but. So on my mission, I went on my mission with that perspective that, hey, we believe in evolution. Like, it's okay. And that was very satisfying to me. I really liked that. We were tracting one day, we were talking at the doorstep to somebody, and he was like saying, hey, I can't believe this Adam and Eve nonsense. And I basically said, hey, it's fine. We believe in evolution. It's all good. And that night, this was my second companion, so I was early on my mission. My second companion, basically, he pulled out the it's the Institute manual. It was the current manual at that time, the Old Testament Institute manual, and it's very, very anti-evolution. It's very pro-creationist, and he said, like, this is the official manual. This is what we believe. And then he also played Bruce R. McConkie, the audio version of Bruce R. McConkie's 7 Deadly Heresies. I didn't know it at the time, but the text version that's posted to the BYU speeches has been drastically edited. And this was Bruce R. McConkie himself did it at the request of, I think, of the president of the church at that time. But so it's not quite the same, but the audio version is very, very anti-evolution. It's very strong. That there's no possible way that this is compatible. And he's like, this is an apostle, and this is how it is, and here's the manual. And at this point, I had such strong conversion experiences previous to this on my mission that I was like, well, the BYU professors must be mistaken somehow, because here it's in the manual, it's the official manual, and here's the apostle speaking so clearly about this. Like, how can you mistake this? And so I essentially just accepted that as truth and decided that there must be something about it that I don't understand. But the reality is evolution is not true, and something else is going on. So for the rest of my mission, then I studied some, not a whole lot, but I studied the creationist literature and different models of, there's different models of catastrophe. It's really just young Earth creationism, but they center around a flood being responsible for most of the geological features and fossil features that we find on the Earth today. And so I studied that and embraced it to some extent. But I went back to BYU, and and again, so I'm a microbiology major, and it just doesn't take long before you're exposed again to just this amazing, just so much data that supports evolution in contradiction to these other theories. And so it wasn't very long before I was like, well, again, it just can't be right. There's just so much data in support of this. But I was most concerned at this point with trying to reconcile the statements of the brethren with evolution, and like, well, how does this work theologically and doctrinally? And so I went and talked to several different professors to try and understand how they did it and reconcile these different things. So I talked to Scott Woodward. He's no longer at BYU. And then I also spoke with Dwayne Jeffries, and he has an interesting and kind of long, complex history with evolution. So he wrote a big article, Seer Savants and Evolution, the Uncomfortable Interface in Dialogue, a while back, and was censured, not by name, but if you knew what he was talking about, he was essentially censured by Ezra Taft Benson and General Conference for his work on this. But in talking to both of these individuals, I was kind of exposed to this idea that maybe the brethren didn't fully understand these issues, and that their words weren't actually representative of this. And so that was, for me, it was my first exposure to this idea that there was tension between brethren, and that there was tension in just even deciding and reconciling what is official, what is doctrine. It wasn't clear cut, and that there is room for some nuance. In graduate school, I ended up doing, you are able to do 3 different rotations to study different types before you decide on what your final kind of PhD work is going to be and which lab you're going to do that in. And one of those laboratories that I worked in was with David Hillis, who studied evolution. He was a herpetologist. He studied primarily like reptilian evolution, but he also was one of the primary advisors in charge of the entire Tree of Life project. So he was essentially one of the head evolutionary biologists in the world, and in charge of assembling a huge tree of life. And that experience, so I worked on computational phylogenetics. So it's this idea of assembling, ancestral trees and relationships, and doing this computationally based on the data. What was so interesting to me was just the sincerity of the people that I was associated with, and their enthusiasm for this project. So I think that was what was so eye-opening at the time, is that you had all these people who just loved what they were doing. They loved being out and and gathering data in the field. And they also were very committed to analyzing the data as objectively as they could, and understanding what it really meant. And there was just, in general, with my PhD, I think the biggest thing, especially as it relates to the church, was just this idea that as far as I could tell, all of the scientists I interacted with were extremely sincere in their search for truth. And you become very aware as you go through a PhD process and you're analyzing different types of models, that that a person's bias and the assumptions you bring into a particular question definitely color the way you interpret the data. But as a scientist, like, this is one of the things that you are constantly doing, is you're constantly trying to step back and say, hey, what are my assumptions? What am I bringing to this? And what do the data say? And what are different ways to interpret the data? And you do this all of the time. Like, you're constantly looking at data sets and asking yourself, what's the best way to interpret this data? And so in general, I guess.
And the double safety is the peer review process, right? I mean.
Yeah, that's right. And I think so. In general, scientists they recognize how easy it is to miss things and perspectives, and so the peer review, it's one of those things. They don't have to do that, right? Like, it's something they impose that upon themselves because they want to get things right. And there are certainly abuses with the peer review system. There are ways around, you have input into who you decide reviews your work, and all, so none of this is a perfect system, but when you are exposed to it, so in that sense, you see the flaws, so science isn't this, it's definitely not perfect. There are issues, there are problems, there are biases, there are egos, but at the same, and there are consensuses that influence the way people view the data. So there are all these issues and problems, but at the same time, there's this sincerity, and there's this perpetual desire to check one's work and to ensure that you are not, that your models are accurate and valid. And in part, it's because, as you're studying the unknown, if you're not getting something right, or if you're overstepping, if you're exceeding what the data actually says, then a future finding will likely negate or undermine something that you've said. And so this is, I think that's one of the things that I appreciated so much about this scientific training, was the idea of saying, this is what the data says, and it doesn't actually justify this conclusion. Like, this, maybe this is right. Maybe it points in this direction, but maybe the data don't allow us to make this final conclusion. And so these slight nuances, these ways of saying the data, we can say this much, but we can't say this much. This type of reservation about one's confidence is very different in many ways than a religious worldview, where you just say, hey, well, I have this, and therefore all of this, I've had a spiritual experience, therefore all of these things must be true. And a scientist would probably be much more hesitant and cautious, or a scientific approach to that.
No, the religious approach is really sort of like an inverse approach, really, because you have like an a priori statements of truth, and then any evidence or empirical evidence you get, you have to somehow fit into the model, right? Whereas in science, the empirical evidence creates the model and creates the theories. And
that's right. And at this point, it's a person who is maybe in favor of young Earth creationism or things like this. Their argument might be that the scientific models are so, some of them, the core models are so entrenched over time that they essentially act like an a priori, right? They'll say, hey, the naturalist, you've just adopted this naturalist perspective and you're not able to transcend that. And there's some, there's some validity to that. But at the same time, I guess I just saw in all of my research and with all of my different peers and advisors, a sincerity about questioning assumptions and in general, just a caution at every turn of just not of being aware of the assumptions that you bring to any discussion. And so there is, like, everybody is willing to question assumptions of evolution, that they are willing to question the geological data, but then they point to the data that support their assumption and say, how do you this is a really reasonable way to look at this, and what's your, how does your model fit the data? The other thing, so one of my peers in my PhD program was actually a young Earth creationist. He was an Anabaptist, and this was in a laboratory where everybody else was believing in evolution. One of the things that we studied in our lab was the evolution of protein networks, among other topics, and that's what he studied. But even for him, so he believed in young Earth creationism, but he kind of admitted that the evidence was very overwhelming and powerful, and so he held space that this actually, it may be true. But at the same time, we had lots of discussions. We would hear a presentation on evolution, usually this is at the molecular level, and we would discuss how you could view that that data from a young Earth creationist perspective and from the evolutionary perspective. And so this was super, to me, I mean, it's great. It was great training in being able to approach data with different models. And we just did that all of the time. It was, it's very constant.
But to remind our listeners, so at that time you were still an Orthodox Mormon, believing Orthodox Mormon.
Yeah, very, very Orthodox. And so most of my service in the church to this time had been in the scouting program. I had been, up to the time that I left, so I ended up doing maybe, I think it was calculated at one time, 16 years of work in scouting, I think is what it was. It was just some huge number, maybe the majority of those as scoutmaster in some capacity. And so we, where I was first scoutmaster was in a kind of a low socioeconomic status type ward in Austin, and you're just working with kids who had almost nothing. So, but we would take them, and they were hiking with pillowcases with their gear because nobody could afford backpacks. So many of them, not all of them, but that's so. But I thought it was really great just to have that experience to hike in and things like that. So yeah, so I just remember half of the hikes, different kids carrying their gear in pillowcases rather than with backpacks. But I loved that aspect of sharing the outdoors with children and with youth, and trying to build character, and also trying to integrate it with the gospel and spiritual lessons. And so yeah, but then the other thing that so in scouting, you become aware of all of the administrative issues, and there's there's an uncomfortable interface between scouting and the LDS program. And now, of course, they've distanced and they've left the scouting program, which I think is good. That's what I wanted them to do years and years and years ago. Even though I value so many aspects of scouting, there were aspects of it that I was just like, the administrative overhead is crazy. It was difficult, especially in these wards with so few resources, it was difficult to run a scouting program and a young men's program. And they always talked about how, well, you just integrate them. It's like, but all that integration of activities and time and all of this, you have one or two people who are running the whole program, and how do you do that effectively? And so I felt like it was the leaders were kind of out of touch with that, and we really should be doing our own program, and it should be mostly focused on preparing people for a mission and things like that. And so so during my graduate work, I was very committed to the church. And so that's what a lot of people end up, many Mormons during graduate school, I think, lose faith in LDS truth claims. And and this gets back to, I guess, another thread is because my uncle, because he had left the church, my family, I began studying the apologetic literature. So from Fair Mormon, and it was Shields, I think, back at the time. It was way back, and Farms was just coming out and doing a lot of work. And so I studied that literature a lot. So I began studying it in high school. And once I got on my mission, it increased. I read as much as I could. And then since then, like during graduate school, I became more and more interested in the apologetic literature. I mean, I was already interested before, but like as an example, my wife would buy me for my Christmas or birthday present, she would buy me a subscription to Farms. So that was my birthday present. And she made me a binder for Farms publications or handouts or just things like this. So I had, as a birthday present. So, this was something that was it kind of as evidence of like, this is something very exciting to me. I really enjoy this. And, so reading all the different Nibley works, reading Jack Welch's work. So John Welch is what he goes by in print, all of his different things. And my wife lived just a few doors down from John Welch. And so, they and his mother and to some extent her father as well were into the apologetics and the academic defense of and exploration of LDS truth claims. And so this was just this was a lot of fun. And I guess I felt like there was all of this positive evidence to fit the LDS model with the data. And so kind of the biggest problem during this time really was just how do you piece together evolution and the different theological tensions. You had all these statements. And so I spent a lot of time working on that. So I was working on a publication really over decades of how to reconcile the two from a theological and doctrinal perspective. How do you get those things to match up really well? So I was planning to go into, work for a pharmaceutical company. And at the end of my graduate work, I met a BYU professor when I was at a conference, and they expressed interest in my skill set and the types of things I was working on. And so I applied as a graduate student to be a professor at BYU, and they accepted me. I wasn't necessarily like an amazing candidate, but they were very interested in the type of work that I was working on, because it would help everybody in the department. And so, so I was hired out of graduate school. And in some departments, that's very common. In biology, it's very uncommon. Very few people are hired like out of graduate school. And so before I went to BYU as a professor, I did a postdoc at in Boulder, Colorado. I had a good experience there. And then in 2010, I started at BYU, as a professor. And from a religious perspective, I mean, this was a great experience because, I had enjoyed my time at BYU. I enjoyed all of the, all the academic activity supporting LDS truth claims. And I thought, like, this is great. I can be, here I am. I can help push the work forward. I can help build testimonies and And so, like in my, so I taught biochemistry and technical writing and in a graduate course in computational proteomics. But the, so my evaluations, they were always, very spiritually, they rate you on all these different things. But I had high rankings on spiritually edifying. And I think this is because I was very committed to the truth claims, very committed to supporting LDS, the LDS perspective, and helping students to reconcile things like evolution and the gospel. And I felt like that was possible to do.
So John and I are back. We had a brief technical break, but we're now back. So John, you were talking about your experience teaching at BYU. So just go ahead.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I became interested in at this time was trying to reconcile the data around a global flood with LDS theology. And the most kind of problematic issue there is, well, so first of all, to go into the data, is the data are overwhelmingly point to the conclusion that there was no flood at 2458 BC or whatever that date is. That if you look at the Ussher Bible chronology, we didn't have, and that's supported by a number of different lines of evidence. And so you can look at it from different ways, but there's speleothem data, which is stalactites and stalagmites. There's annual depositions. You can look at ice core data. You can look at varves, which are seasonal lake deposits that you get at the bottom of lakes. And then there's tree ring data, and there's fossilized tree ring data, and those can be in the same area. You can line these up. So tree ring data goes back, 10,000 years. You can get varves and speleothems go back, 20 and 50, and ice cores go back 100,000 years, things like that. And so all of that data, and then there's the species data. So my wife was a biology major and a teacher, biology teacher for a short time, and so she was also very familiar with this the data of the number of species that exist on the Earth. There's 90,000 different species, insect species. There's like 115,000 unidentified insect species just on the North American continent, and the number of species and their geographical distribution is very inconsistent with a global flood, roughly 4,500 years ago. And like another example, a good example of that would be like the kangaroo fossil record. So understanding like that's all in Australia, and of course current kangaroos are in Australia, and so this is inconsistent with the idea that there was kangaroos maybe were dispersed everywhere, because it would require that kangaroos might somehow migrated from Australia to the Ark, went on the Ark, and then they migrated back to Australia, right? Like, so the fossil record says they were there, they've been there, and so and then just the number of species that are required to sort of repopulate the Earth, you would, in order to do that, you would, the young Earth creationist view is that maybe just a few types were put onto the Ark, and then those rapidly evolved. But again, it's one of those things, like the assumption there is that, well, where's the evidence for this just rapid evolution in 3,500 years ago? And that's not consistent with the current paces. I mean, we can measure in the time that we've been doing data, this type of data, we know what the rates of evolution are. It's just, so there's many lines of evidence, orthogonal lines of evidence, where you're looking at totally different strands of data, and they don't support a global flood. And this is...
Can I, John, just quickly intersect that? On the other hand, there are good theories and evidences about a local flood in that area.
Correct. And this is what I really grasped onto. And just to finish, just my last point is, if you go to BYU And if you go to the geology department, as an example, and you ask any professor in the biology department at BYU, was there a global flood at roughly 2500 BC? They will say, no, absolutely not. They'll be extremely, and I had these conversations. So as a professor, I was interested in all these topics. I went and taught just to confirm that what I was reading, this is the way, strong testimony, believing LDS professors at BYU, how they viewed the data. And it's overwhelming and consistent that everybody, nobody who has studied this data set believes that there was a global flood at this time. But that's right. So it turns out on the flip side there, you can interpret the flood story as a local flood. In the scriptures, this is like, so, the word for earth is eretz. It's not necessarily meant to be a global flood. Nibley pointed this out a long time ago, is that, hey, like, why is Noah even sending out the bird to see if there's dry land? It's like, it's clear that he's not even has a perception of the whole earth. So there are indicators within the story itself that that it wasn't a global flood. The Hebrew doesn't tie us to a global flood. And so and there's also, so in the book of Moses, I think it's Moses 1:29. So the famous book verse from Moses that we in LDS we use 139, but 129 talks about how there's many lands, and each land was called earth. And so so I took this to mean that Joseph Smith through inspiration had even restored this potentially this true view of the flood, which was that it was a local flood. And so the earth was covered, but the earth is just the land. It's that area, it's that vicinity. And so I was doing this, but the part of it that you still have to do is you have to account for, why were these early LDS leaders getting it wrong? What were they doing? Because if it was revelation, then God's not wrong on this. He knows what the actual story is. So how do we get these two things to merge together properly? And so I began studying the history of the development of the idea of the earth's baptism in LDS thought. Like, so there's this idea in LDS thought that the earth needs a baptism itself, and so the flood was a cleansing, and the millennium will be, as it burns, that's the baptism by fire with the Holy Ghost. And so there's these parallels with the earth and our own salvation. And so I tried to understand, like, well, where did these ideas come from? Was this revelation? And so as I studied, I found that, to begin with, the person who introduced this in LDS thought to a great degree was Orson Pratt. I've since read some other or seen some other data that William Phelps was W.W. Phelps was the first person to kind of hint at these ideas, but it was really Orson Pratt who really promulgated these thoughts. So it wasn't done through a prophet. But then where did he get these? It turns out that these ideas were over in England, where he was a mission president. They were talking about this idea. There was a prominent preacher who was talking about that. There was a book written, and it was a book inside the book that talks about the idea that the ancient, or the American Indians or Native Americans were from the lost 10 tribes. They also talk about this idea that the flood was a baptism for the earth. And so, this would have been a book that would have been interesting to Latter-day Saints. And then the other source where this was being discussed was among the Campbellites. And as we know, the Sidney Rigdon was a Campbellite, before. And so the LDS movement was closely related to the Campbellite movement, and they were talking about this idea. And and when I studied, I had done the same thing with evolution, studying how, Joseph Fielding Smith, most of his ideas about no death before the fall and the atonement in the fall were derived from George McCready Price, a Seventh-day Adventist geologist. And really, most geologists would say, pseudoscientist. It is not valid science. And in fact, when they were having the debates with B.H. Roberts and Joseph Fielding Smith at the time, James Talmage wrote to his son, who was a geology professor, and he said, "Hey, what do you think about these geological ideas and your department? What do current active researching geologists think?" And there's these are just so untenable. They miss so much of the data. It's very bad science, and it's only tenable from within a religious perspective, really. And so but the point is that I saw the same pattern in evolution as I did with the flood story, and that was that the brethren who were promulgating these ideas had really imbibed them, or had accrued them from the environment that they were in. And so the Protestant Christian environment, they're the ones who talked about these things. And once I saw that pattern, then it became, to my mind, I saw that this was happening in other ways. And so to just kind of to contrast it, so they were imbibed as opposed to received by revelation. Right. When you dig into the details, what it looks to be is that they were, well, what the data say is these ideas were definitely in the culture, in the milieu of that time. And when they were first introduced, they were almost always introduced very tentatively. They were like, well, this is, maybe it was like this, or, and then, but at some point, the president or somebody would latch onto it, so what you saw was this sort of evolution of thought, rather than here's the lightning and here's the this is what the doctrine is, and it looked to be much more incremental, but it was to the point where it became official. It looked official by the time we get it 100 years later. It looks to be very official. At the time, this was very helpful to my worldview, and it was very helpful in believing in LDS doctrine, because what it allowed me to do is to say, hey, the brethren had made a mistake with these things. They were pulling things in from their culture, and that allowed them, and that's why they just got this wrong. But fortunately, most of this isn't strongly official. And so we can just say, yeah, some things they get wrong. They have their own opinions, and sometimes they don't even know that they're just opinions, and that's okay. And so at the time, this was, when I was doing this research, the whole purpose of it was to find a way to keep the truth claims strong and also accept the scientific realities. And so the way that you end up doing that is you just have to say the brethren got it wrong, is where I landed on these issues. And that's okay. At the time, I felt like that was okay, at least. So this is nearing chronologically the point of time when I went through my faith transition. And so I think the way to talk about that is to talk about, there were kind of 5 different people who were really influential at this time. And just briefly,
John, before we go to that, I just want to, I think the last story, or the stories about the evolution and the flood, and how you approach them, right? I think they illustrate or emphasize something that I have also experienced, and I think something that we're able to observe is that for a believer, for a strong, firm believer, let's say the modus operandi of basically approaching information and different topics, and that can be problematic, is that it's based on, or it's working around, it's involved around trying to make, let's say, the gospel come out plausible.
Yeah.
Because I mean, obviously you enjoy your experience at that church. This is all that you've ever known. It has many positive, beneficial parts to it. You know, the Latter-day Saint lifestyle. And so the whole apologetic enterprise really is to make sure you can go to bed at night in peace, saying that it's okay, or it can be okay. There are some answers
it
that
can be okay. Yeah,
it can be okay, and it's not a big problem. You keep putting stuff on the shelf, so to speak, right? Like those binders behind me. So you keep putting issues on the shelf, and really, I mean, as long as you are in the paradigm, it really doesn't matter how many things are on the shelf. I mean, but I mean, once the transition happens, then it starts to matter.
Then it starts to matter. That's right. And if you didn't have many things on your shelf, you might be able to go back and re-examine them and find more shelf space, or so to speak, you know, and ways to deal with those issues. But that's right. A person. So, you know, for me, my shelf broke almost instantaneously, and I attribute that in part to the fact that I had been studying so much of LDS literature, but also just broadly, so many ideas, that when that happened, I saw that, and we'll get to that in a second, but I think it's an interesting, but that's right. The point at which you change is the point at which you say, is it possible that another model fits the data better? And, you know, as a scientist, I'm almost ashamed at myself for taking so long to have that genuine, you know, reflection and circumspection to say, well, this, you know, should I be viewing this differently? Is there a better way to view the data? But once I finally arrived at that point where I asked myself, like, is there a better way to think about this? Then it was almost instantaneous, because then you just realize that there's a different fit. But so I'll approach that in just a second. I can wind. Yeah. So just to go through it, there were a few things that contributed to my view, the change in the way I viewed this. Because again, I was very, 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 you know, very devout, very believing, always reading my scriptures, praying, you know. For many years, I listened to all of the General Conference talks over and over again. I would run and listen to the scriptures, and I would memorize hymns. I memorized dozens and dozens and dozens of hymns, right? So that I would sing constantly. I was very immersed and very devout in the way I believed, and definitely, you know, focusing on Jesus and his the atonement and all these types of things. So very, very devout. So what happened at BYU during this time is I had three friends, and then I'll mention two other people. But a fellow professor at BYU in my department approached me, and he confided in me. So this is a private conversation, and he said, you know, and this person to me seemed like a very, so he was super smart. He was very well respected in the department. And he was very spiritual. In his spare time, he, like as a young professor, he had earned a master's in choral conducting degree on the side for fun, for spiritual edification and intellectual engagement, right? A master's degree in choral conducting.
Wow.
While he's a professor in biochemistry. And he was always, you know, really nice guy. But anyway, he came to me and he said, look, you know, like I've been reading a lot of theological literature, right? He's just been reading broadly. And he says, the Book of Mormon to me looks like 19th century Protestant theology. He's like everything about, and just the themes, it feels like a 19th century work to me. And so we had several conversations about this, and I had been reading, I felt I'd been prepared for this moment for decades, reading all of the farms literature and Fair Mormon and all the different defenses. I'm like, look, chiasmus and Hebraisms and all these ancient evidences and parallels. Like, look at all these. Like, you don't want to give this up so fast. But at the same time, I was able to sincerely just kind of look at that perspective and just kind of at least sit with it. I didn't accept it at the time, but I was like, well, you're right. Like there's some things that look 19th century about the book. And then I also had a graduate student who was very influential at this time. So he was again, another really bright person, extremely smart, very motivated. And he was also just super devout to a level that I hadn't seen among many other people. So there were very few people who, like, for instance, studied the gospel, studied the scriptures on the level that I felt like I studied the scriptures, but he was one of those. And maybe to exceed, my level of dedication. So like, as an example, he seriously contemplated doing a 40-day fast, even if it killed him, type. Like he was at this sort of next level. And he had gotten into Denver Snuffer, reading about Denver Snuffer and his works. And he also had an experience where he claimed to have spoken face to face with Jesus Christ. And so,
but just in a sentence or two, I think some of my listeners will not know who Denver Snuffer is, but okay, I know something about him, but do you want to just quickly say?
So yeah, he's a lawyer from Sandy, Utah, and he essentially believes that Joseph Smith was a legitimate prophet. The Book of Mormon is true, but the church lost its way, probably didn't, is in some level of apostasy since then. And then he also emphasizes the fact that through following, a certain procedure, you can actually speak with Jesus face to face. So these are some of his key claims. He was excommunicated a few years ago. Those are, the idea that the church is in apostasy is something the church doesn't look too kindly upon. And so, and so he, we went on, we drove to a conference in Minnesota. And so we had 40 hours of driving or some ridiculous amount of time, and, a ton of time together. And we talked about all of these types of issues. And again, he's another person, one of the few people who had studied the gospel and the academics on the same level, but he wasn't afraid of pointing out problems with the institutional church. And he was, I think, at this time, he was a little bit early in his time at this point. So he was also excommunicated a little while ago, and primarily because of some of his criticisms of the current institutional church. And then the third person was my neighbor. He had helped start the blog Rational Faiths. And this is where so RFM blogged on this site a long time ago. Actually, in part, I think when he was still kind of more of a believer in LDS.
RFM is Radio Free Mormon, who now has his own, podcast and his own blog.
That's right.
Just Google him.
Yeah, my neighbor had been doing this, and then my neighbor also had my wife write some articles and do some reviews of different books. And so my wife was reading more about Elijah Abels and the priesthood being given to Black men in Nauvoo, and just different issues. And so she was researching church issues at the time as well. But he lost his faith in the LDS truth claims and left the church. And so he was my next door neighbor. And so I spent a lot of time talking with him and just, trying to understand his point of view. And again, in all of these cases, I felt like there was no way that, my testimony was so deep, and my belief in all of these positive evidences for the LDS truth claims was so strong that my goal was to be able to help these people to find ways to reconcile. But in doing so, I also tried to legitimately understand their perspective and understand the validity of the claims that they were making. And then in addition to this, so I found out that my sister had been struggling with polygamy, with Joseph Smith's polygamy, and some of those issues. And then as well, it became apparent during this time, more that my wife had struggled with some of the race and the priesthood issues, and especially as she was researching these things, and so we were talking about them more, it became clear that she wasn't 100% on board with all of these teachings. And so anyway, so it wasn't as much. So some of the issues were really important. The other part that was important to this was just seeing that there were sincere, honest, good people who had genuine issues with, and what I would say is at least somewhat valid. They, to me, I was like, there's some validity here, even if I didn't believe it, but at least somewhat valid. So seeing that allowed me, I think, my mind to begin considering that it was possible that LDS truth claim, weren't as solid as I had previously thought. And what really, one of the linchpins was a conversation I had. It was in August, so this was just before my faith transition, just a couple of months. Is that my friend, my friend who, the graduate student into Denver Snuffer types of worldviews, he had posted a link to a video talking about spiritual experiences and showing that other people from other faiths had similar types of experiences to LDS testimony experiences. And so in this example, this was done by Chris Johnson and Dwayne Johnson. I've met Dwayne. It was done by Chris. I think Dwayne is featured in it, but I've since met Dwayne. Super nice guy. It shows different people of different faiths, different fundamentalist LDS type groups, the Heaven's Gate cult that eventually, so they all killed them. They ended their lives. But they, the leader basically said, hey, if you go pray about these things, don't take my word for it. You should go pray about these things yourself and seek God, and he'll tell you that these things are true. And then, but the problem is then, we don't accept any of those claims that basically, I forget some of them are really fantastical, but they're that basically like God is returning on a spaceship behind the Halley-Bopp comet or something like this. And, nobody accepts these types of claims. We would all kind of agree that they're ridiculous, but they were clearly sincere in their beliefs to the point that they ended their lives in their beliefs. So very, they felt that those were very strong. And even, when I first heard those, I immediately thought of ways to preserve my belief. And this, I actually have the conversation here. I can read what I said.
Please do.
So I was talking this over. It was my friend who had introduced it to me, and I was saying, very interesting video. I've seen a lot of similar things. Like check out Christopher Nemelka and his followers. Also, I've read into all the different psychological and physiological responses. They're well documented that people interpret as the spirit. I believe in spiritual communication, but I'm also fully cognizant that it is very imprecise. And then I say, look, the presentation is very convincing, but it does have a couple holes or issues. He presents an artificial brain-God dichotomy. As a biochemist, I think that spiritual experiences are from the brain, but that is part of our soul. Why wouldn't God communicate via our soul? In other words, via our brain. I realize this doesn't destroy the notion that spiritual experiences are just brain reflections, but neither does the idea that spiritual experiences are brain reflections destroy the possibility that they are from God. And the spiritual experiences that all these folks are having may indeed be from God, or as you say, from false spirits, but they are misinterpreting the implications of what that feeling means. How does God answer a very nebulous question like, is Islam true? He can say, yeah, lots of good stuff in there, but lots of garbage too. Then the recipient layers in extra meaning. This is the only true faith, etc. And my conclusion, the take home really is spiritual feelings only get you so far. You have to question and sift through them. But the problem is that as soon as you say, well, somebody from Islam, maybe they've misinterpreted their spiritual feeling. They've said I had this powerful spiritual experience. That doesn't mean all of Islam is true. Maybe just parts of it are true, or maybe it's generally true. And then when your mind hits upon that, then you at some point you realize that the same logic also applies to LDS truth claims. Is, well, what if our truth claims are similarly, what if we've read too much into the spiritual feeling? Maybe there's at this
Sure.
point I still believed in God. Maybe there's a God and these types of things. So this was, I think subconsciously, consciously, I wasn't too worried about this. Subconsciously, I think my mind worked on this, and this was a linchpin, because all of the other issues, all of the other problems, I think mentally I would always fall back on. Well, I've had these very powerful spiritual experiences. I have persistent, I read my scriptures every day. I feel peace and joy. It's like so therefore this is true. And then, but the idea that others are having similar spiritual experiences, and you can see their sincerity, and that was for me like a linchpin that allowed the crystallization of all of these issues into a different model. Mm-hmm. And so, I left BYU, and it was completely unrelated to any of these issues. So financially, it was just really difficult to get the work that we were doing up and going. I was very successful as a young professor. Like, we eventually published, well over 20 papers. We were doing really well academically, but financially it was difficult to, like, our research was very expensive. The equipment was very expensive. And I felt like, looking around at all the other professors who didn't have good funding, that they just had kind of miserable lives as professors in an academic world. And so and there was no way I was going to be able to do my research on the type of funding that I was getting at that time. And nobody was getting good funding at this time. So there was a dip in NIH funding in general. And so I was written into tons of grants with my colleagues, but they weren't getting grants. So if anybody had gotten grants, I would have been fine. I would have remained at BYU, and I would have received tenure. So my chair told me this when I decided to leave. He said, if you stay, you will get tenure. You're very likely to get tenure based on, my publications at this point were all kind of rolling in. I had good teaching scores. And so, but I decided that it was untenable financially. But as soon as I left, so that's one of the things I think that,
John, before we go to that, after you left BYU, I want to just a quick remark, but because I think it's important. There's some lesson there that I think you can. What you just said kind of resonated with myself also. Is that if you want to keep your faith intact, or let's say your paradigm intact, at least in a certain way, then you have to be able to think egocentrically, basically, meaning that whatever dynamics you observe in the world, they apply to those other people or those other groups. But there is always some kind of an circumstance, extenuating circumstance, that it does not apply to you or your religion.
Yeah.
And that's it takes a lot of courage and maturity to open up to the reality that actually it applies to your group the same way.
Yeah, it's really difficult to do. Yeah, and scientifically, it's you practice this all the time. It's the idea, your model should be generalizable, and logically, what we often do, most of the arguments that are defending against, I would say, the most difficult challenges, mostly amount to special pleading, which means that we're making exceptions for our own view that we wouldn't make for another worldview. And so that means that our model might be bad because we can't generalize those principles out the way we would like to.
And if you don't mind, I will quickly insert that obviously, as people can they can see that I have no problems with being critical about the church, and can totally identify with what you're talking about. I don't want to say that let's say being open about the issues and trying to approach them objectively necessarily means that a person will hand their resignation to the church, right? Because some people, there are obviously people who will never even consider those issues because they say, well, it's anti-Mormon stuff, or it's of the devil because whatever it is the true church, so whatever is against the church must be of the devil or must be wisdom of man or whatever. And I think that and then there are other people who will also have this transition, and they might let's say decide to remain involved with the church for some other reasons, being fully aware of the problems and it might be difficult for them to, let's say, be involved authentically or whatever. We're not trying to. The point of the podcast is not to drive anyone out of the church. If you were wondering, the point of the podcast is to talk as openly, objectively, and sincerely about questions, and then to let's say analyze a faith journey and like what kind of effect your journey has had in your life. I've talked to other people in the podcast who have had different journeys, but to talk to you who have had this journey, to validate and understand what you have gone through and why you have made the decisions that you have made.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's such a great comment. And that's, I think that's one of the things that that I'm convinced of as an example is that, so the different scholars engaged in LDS scholarly studies, these are some extremely bright and sincere and wonderful people. And that's where I guess, I still have just tremendous respect for them. And because some of them I know to differing degrees, these are great and wonderful people. And that's right. And the data, people can look at the data and apply a different model to it. And essentially what's happening is we're all weighting different aspects slightly differently. Like some people might say, well, this matters a lot. And other people might say, well, this matters a lot. And then now when you apply these weights to the data, then you can say, well, maybe, a person can sincerely look at this data set and say, this is a better fit. I think this fits the data better. And I'm okay with that. I think, there are some people who leave the LDS faith and they have a very hard time understanding how anybody who's familiar with some of the problem areas can remain in the faith. And I think because I did that for so many years, reading through the apologetic literature and things like this, is like, look, there's a powerful case to be made for the authenticity of LDS truth claims. There are some very difficult problems. There are ways to diffuse those problems so that they're not as damaging. And in fact, there's really, and I think it's fair to say that that you can't. The model is extremely robust, and in fact, you can't undermine it. You can't really undermine it completely. So, I've done a lot of analysis on this. Just thinking through different issues, and like one example is, so there's all these mechanisms in place that allow a person to preserve LDS truth claims. One example I call is the all-powerful partition algorithm. And so what happens is, as you discover something bad in LDS history or with science or whatever it is, it's easy to say, hey, this is just the failings of men, or this is meant to be a test that God's testing us in some way. But all the good things, look at all the good things. These are great. And so if we everything that's coming at us, if we partition out all the bad things and say, this is man, and we say, here's the good things, this is God. Now, that's just super powerful. Like, how do you beat that? Well, maybe that's the case. Maybe that's really what's happening. And the only way the reason I call it all powerful is because it turns out that other institutions use the same algorithm. So Jehovah's Witnesses use the same algorithm. So I have statements where they're talking through the same things. And Catholics use the same algorithm. So they'll talk about this all the time with their bishops and their priests and the Pope, is that, well, they're men also. So they're using the same algorithm. And when you use that algorithm, if you tease apart all of the things from men as being just, this is men, and then this is all the good things are from God, then when you just focus on the good things, it almost, these institutions look divine. They're really amazing, and it looks like God's guiding them and helping them, and that's what they see also. So they're seeing that same vision.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but I will go even further, and I will say that I think that I am pretty sure that there are some, Jews, Catholics, you name it, other religious organizations where, because they're so old and they've been through so many, developments and they've had so much time to react to the times and the whatever, that I think that, let's say, they have, they still exist, right? You could say that, well, if everyone was reasonable and rational about it, people would not go there. They would just leave the church. Like how can you be a Catholic knowing all the bad that has occurred throughout history? And
that's a great example.
I think that
is very reasonable.
And I think what happens is that most people will find out, or let's say figure out that, well, those things are not really tenable, but I don't know, my ancestors have been Catholics or whatever. Like, this is part of the culture, this is part of the heritage now. I think probably many people are, if not atheist, they're agnostic at least, who attend these churches. They adjust their level of belief and activity to their personal preferences, right? And I think that the same fate awaits the LDS Church also. It's just we haven't had time for it to play out. These others have had millennia for this to play out.
Right. And that's I think the difficult part then is, LDS faith transitions or viewing things in this way is very painful, because right now there isn't a lot of space for nuanced belief in LDS claims. There's not a lot of space for saying, hey, I'm just going to view this symbolically or figuratively. And that's really, in some way, from the perspective of a person who doesn't believe the strict truth claims, that's really unfortunate. The members of the church believe that the power of their movement is derived from the reality of those claims. And so it's very difficult to even have the conversations about truth claims, because it's such a motivating effect on, the claim itself has such a motivating effect. But yeah, I think the arc of history for other religions suggests that this is regardless, it's the claims aren't so powerful in and of themselves, and that eventually, at the very least, there'll be space made for those with nuanced views to exist happily in the faith. Just like today, I think there's a lot of people who don't view Catholic truth claims as real, but they're still Catholic. They're still part of the heritage. They will still attend church occasionally, as an example. But but yeah, so right now we're in this very difficult time early on in the LDS faith when that's happening. So the other part that's probably worth talking about is some of my work at BYU, and then this is sort of motivated with family. Is I expected when I went through these things that I would be able to talk to my family, my believing family, about these issues, and they would. We'd have frank discussions about them. They would see the validity of my points. They would probably accept my point. At the very least, they would accept the validity of what I was doing and my choice, and understand my position. As it turns out, those conversations are very difficult to have with believing members, and most of them don't want to have them, at least initially, and it can be very threatening. I think in my case, I was probably the most, there were some others, but my brother-in-law was very devout also and very well read. And at the same time that I was going through my faith transition, my sister and he were having a faith transition. And so we kind of left the church at the same time. And then it wasn't too long after that I had another brother who, initially he gave me a lot of pushback. He's like, what's going on? And but eventually he and his wife, and she had been going through, I would say, the beginnings of a faith transition for a long time. And so once you're given the permission to evaluate your faith separately, like if you see someone else leave, that's kind of the case that had happened to me as well. I had friends who gave me the permission to re-examine my worldview. Then I had other siblings who left the church too. But then some of, with my parents were on a mission during my faith transition. And so, we talked, I remember going to New York City and talking about my faith transition with them in their missionary apartment. And this is a terrible time to be considering that your worldview might be, might not be as sound as you hope you would like it to be. And so it took a long time, but so one of the things that motivated me to continue researching was to understand how could I have these conversations or why couldn't I have these conversations with my family members? And so I did a lot of study into the relationship between members and former members, and compiling statements of leaders like, well, why are former members viewed the way they are viewed? And it turns out that there is a narrative that's almost entirely negative about former members, that they're morally weak, that they are, possessed by Satan, maybe aware or unaware, that they just wanted to sin, or that they were too prideful. So the intellectual ones, ultimately it can be viewed as a thing as like, well, they just want their own intellect has now, they think they're smarter than the brethren.
You can read this right in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that's right. It's some of those themes are right there, and with some of the narratives with Korihor, and so Korihor, he seems very reasonable and intellectual. It turns out he's actually been deceived by Satan, and he really ultimately wants the people to be able to sin, right? Like those narratives are baked in. That's right, very early on, in LDS theology. So one of the things that I'm involved in now is a dialogue group at BYU with the religion professors. And this is, I think, an interesting story. And so I'll just tell it briefly here, is kind of, and this sort of represents where I'm at today in this is, there was a video online that I was watching. It was a dialogue between atheists and some BYU professors about, and I guess it was about faith transitions and atheism, and the BYU professors had commented that they weren't aware of any doctrines that were motivating how members were treating former members so poorly. Like as an example, the atheists had brought up the example of somebody being kicked out of their home because they didn't believe, and they were like, look, this isn't part of the gospel. And, and I don't know the doctrine that would motivate these types of actions. And so I had been studying this topic in some depth. And so I wrote to both of the professors and I said, hey, look, here's the doctrine that motivates this. It turns out there's some scriptures in, I think it's 1st or 2nd John. And they basically say that if you come across somebody who doesn't believe in the resurrection properly, that you shouldn't say hi to them. And when you go read in the manual, it refers you to a talk by Elder Ballard, and it discusses how you're supposed to treat false prophets and false teachers. And it also it allows you to categorize, well, who is a false prophet? Who is a false teacher? And so, and if you look at it, it's essentially what a former Mormon is who left because of intellectual types of reasons. They don't believe in Joseph Smith and the first vision. They don't believe in the authority claims of the leadership. And it's like, and anyway, so we had this dialogue, and one of the professors wrote back to me, and it was just, he was like, hey, well, let's talk about it. And discuss it. And so I went into his office, and actually for the course of several years, we had several different discussions, like hours-long discussions talking about faith transitions and how members are viewed and all these types of things. And it turns out that this professor was in charge of the interfaith dialogue at BYU. So this is J.B. Hawes, and just a phenomenally warm, welcoming, and intelligent, man, like just, very good academically. He's written a lot of great stuff. And so we eventually decided that we ought to try and broaden this conversation that we were having that we felt was very productive. And so we created a committee or that was a dialogue group. And so BYU has they have about 5 different dialogue groups currently with Pentecostalism and evangelicals and Judaism and a couple others. And so we created a dialogue group in the pattern of these interfaith dialogue groups. And so it was, we ended up, this was just after the Russell and Nelson had urged everybody to stop using the word Mormon. And so it was going to be the former Mormon dialogue group or something like this, but instead it's community and dialogue, members and former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's the name we officially gave the group. So we involved some of the friends that I had made actually on Reddit in a discussion group. So really bright fellow, really nice guy, and his wife, and my wife. She agreed to participate. And then John Ogden, he's written a great book on, it's called When Mormons Doubt, a way to save relationships or something to that effect. I get the byline wrong, but so he had been thinking about in this space for a while. It's like, how do we do this? And our goal being that, look, there are people leaving the church, and how do we facilitate these conversations and make the transition better? How do we preserve relationships? And so we, and on their side, so there were several different professors who talked with us. And then we also brought in some professional counselors, and we also had general counsel from BYU in the discussions with us. So to talk about, it could help on the legal issues. And he had actually also been involved in LGBT work around the university, so had been thinking in terms of bridge building already. And so this particular group was, has been super interesting. And we ended up now it's been, I think it's been over a year, but we ended up talking to the entire BYU counseling department and center. So there was maybe 40 different people who attended a panel discussion where we discussed issues of faith transition. And it turns out that the counseling center, even though maybe a third of the students that they're seeing because of faith transition issues, there had been no systematic way that they were trying to approach faith transitions and these types of things. Like every counselor or therapist was kind of doing it themselves. And so this was for them, so many of them stayed after for hours and just talked to us about these different issues. And it was really a great experience. And so we're trying to, with COVID, it's kind of fallen by the wayside a bit, but we hope to kind of do this again, and with the hopes of doing more panel discussions. And, and the basic idea is, are there ways that we can build community? Are there ways to bridge the theological divide? And so, I made reference to the fact that there's so much negative, there's so much that's written that's negative about former members, but how do we find positive stories where we can bring everybody together and find common ground? And so the first few things that came out of this is really a focus on some of the things that John Ogden had identified in his book. And that's just saying, look, there's this foundation of truth, beauty, and goodness. And those are things that they're considered transcendent virtues. The Greeks believed in them. People throughout all cultures, all times, have kind of believed in these ideas of truth, beauty, and goodness. And these are ways of wrapping your head around the fact that they may not believe in the LDS claims or in God, but we can still get behind goodness. We can still get behind truth. We all care about truth, and we all care about beauty. And this is, there's value in the LDS culture and the religion and the rituals. There's this beauty there, and there's truth there, and there's goodness there, and there's goodness in people who have left and are doing a different path. And that's been, so for me is, I was very spiritual and spiritually oriented as a member, and that hasn't changed. So I still, I'm all, I love listening to spiritual music. I love listening, and my definition has broadened of like, well, what is spiritual, right? Mm-hmm. Like I have a much broader view of that at this point. Mm-hmm. But I enjoy meditating. I love reflecting and thinking. I love spiritual dialogue. It's like, what motivates you? What are you passionate about? And understanding like what makes people tick and those types of things. And so, so that's been anyway. So truth, beauty, and goodness is this paradigm that we can really build upon, I think. And then there are theologically, there are some messages that I think we can grab onto. And a good example of this is the story of the Good Samaritan. And the case there is, for that time, the Samaritans were kind of like a former member, right? They were heretical. They didn't believe in the standard claims. And so you can say, well, why did Jesus choose the Samaritan as the good person in his dialogue? And so you can think like today, if we were retelling that story, the Good Samaritan might have been a former member of the church, somebody who had left, so that can be, I think, very inspiring to kind of just think through these stories, the parables, and our theology, and say, is there room for non-believers in good faith to be part of the community of Latter-day Saints and part of just the community of goodness? And that's where, personally, I feel like that's where we can sit and find that common ground, is like, it isn't goodness. We want to be good. We want to find goodness. We want to live a good life. Mm-hmm. And we want to do it together, right? Like this idea of Zion, what is Zion? It's being of one heart. And there, ultimately, I think the highest level of Zion, in my opinion, is this idea that we, even though we have different ways of viewing the data and different feelings about how to live our best and a good life, but we can somehow do that together, right? Somehow do that in community and support each other in the goodness. And that's kind of, that's the goal, I think.
Yeah, I have, these ideas are popping up in my mind when I hear this, is that in a sense, like nation states in Europe are able to do that. And like I'm an Estonian, we had a clear sense of identity. We always wanted to be free from the communist Soviet rule, which was also, a different nation. So, yeah, I mean, when the opportunity presented itself, we were more than happy to regain our independence and build up our country, even throughout all the, the difficulties. And it wasn't easy. I still remember myself having been a kid at that time. And I think Mormons are sort of like a nation, right? I mean, they've always been, let's say, talked about as that. Utah was going to be its own country. The desire of the leaders was such, but obviously, eventually, the U.S. became so strong and widespread that that was not going to be an option. But yeah, I think Mormons, especially in Utah and Idaho, that area, they obviously, you can easily approach them, or they have these let's say traits of a nation state too. So and that's why I think that the way I view it is that church is sort of like an additional, you could say, opportunity, but also an additional burden, because if you are doing your best, being a good father, husband, employee, entrepreneur, taxpayer, you're already basically building God's kingdom, your own nation state, right? And so what I have sort of felt is that, I don't want to have this huge dichotomy in my life. Like, so whenever I do something for the church, I build up the kingdom of God. And then whatever I do other than that is some kind of, let's say, serving my own interest and being selfish and, I don't know, identifying with Babylon or something. To me, I try to do my everyday work so that I am contributing, I'm building God's kingdom that way. Actually, once Elder Christofferson had a good quote at a general conference that every honest work is God's work. So I've remembered that. and so
I love that view, and it's difficult because the LDS worldview is very dichotomized with Babylon, as you say, when you just say that, right? Like it's the world, like we say that the world, and it's almost always a negative connotation. Where like there's us, and then everybody outside of us, and the world is just it's going to it's so problematic, and there's a lot of fear about that, and really I think the best way to, or a paradigm to look at it is that the Latter-day Saint world is also just a microcosm. It's a reflection of that larger world. There's good and there's bad, even within the church, and there's failing. Most people are trying to do good and be better. A lot of people are just struggling. A lot of people are just looking for support and a place to belong. And it's the same in the world, as you step outside of the LDS faith in terms of your identity and these types of things, you realize the world is a similar playing field. There are some terrible people in it doing terrible things. There are also wonderful people in it. There are wonderful atheists. There are wonderful, agnostics. There are wonderful Wiccans and Seventh-day Adventists. And there's just all, so there's just all this variety. But by and large, most people want to do good and be good, I think, and they want to help, and and yeah.
I don't know how you feel. I also feel that this has been my experience that, I joined the church, I was 20 years old. And, when you're young, there are many things that kind of work together for you to be active and faithful in the church. Is that, first of all, you trust the the elders. You trust the outside authority more. You have more energy to study this and study that. You're still learning a lot of things, and the church experience is actually, I have to tell you honestly, the church was a huge blessing in my life, because I had all sorts of problems, and being actively involved in the church helped me, have a strong discipline foundation. I learned a lot of good things in the church about public speaking, leadership, organizing, preparation, everything that has helped me to be a good professional and be successful outside of the church. So it's very good for a young person, developing person. At some point, though, I felt that obviously the things you also discussed is that basically the hard facts just don't add up. Like the things we know about the world as it is don't support much of the stuff that that is part of the church's doctrine. And the other thing is that I started to notice that a lot of the times the effort that I put into serving in the church, and I told you before that I have been very involved in the leadership, is that and coupled with the let's say the cognitive dissonance that I was experiencing, it started to turn me into some kind of I don't know, maybe it's a wrong word, but a wrong expression, but some kind of like a moral monster, like that is trying to live up to some standards and be this huge leader in the church. And then on the other hand, within myself, having this huge turmoil and oftentimes this anxiety and anger, then I would express it with my family, right? And destroying almost the most important thing that there is, right? My closest relationships, and let alone never talking to my former non-member friends and so forth, and my own parents and my own brothers and sister, never have time for them. I don't care about them. They're not members, and so forth. Your family the church becomes your family, right? And all the other issues is that, so when I started to step back from activity in the church, to the extent, and then also discovered the meditation and started to, let's say, adjust my paradigm about what is good, what is desirable, what we should strive for, and so forth, what we should focus on in life, what kind of type of energy I should allocate to this or that. I was able to see, now that I am less attached to the church or committed to the church, I am a better father, a better husband, a better son, a better brother, a better friend. And so it's just like a developmental stage, right? So what I'm trying to say is that church was very beneficial and very important for me at that stage in my life. But, over the years, I changed, my understanding changed, my levels of energy changed, and my priorities changed. Other priorities became more important. It's much more important for me, the relationship I have with my teenage daughters, than anything that's going on at church, or whatever I believe or whatnot, And so I judge my, and basically that's why I don't have, obviously I do think about these things, but this fear that I'm doing some kind of horrible sin by not being as devoted to the church, or even not believing in it, I don't have, this does not feel like some kind of a, like sin, or tragedy or unrighteousness to me because I'm witnessing the fruits of my transition. The fruits are good.
Yeah, and I think that this is, when people leave the faith, people leave under different circumstances. There's really probably different ways of leaving. I think a lot of times when people leave when they're really young, it's done in sort of a rebelliousness, and they're sort of leaving against the church, and they're in a rebellion against it, and so they sort of adopt everything that they can that's the other way of doing things. And a lot of times that may not actually be what they need, or what is most is the most joyful way to live their life. And so a lot of these people, I think, don't necessarily have the greatest experience. I mean, maybe they need that time to rebel or whatever for a while. I think people more like you and I, who transitioned more deliberately, and it was, to me, I guess I view it as yeah, that's right, as sort of a spiritual progression. And it's not to say that it's above or better than other trajectories, because there are other valid trajectories, and there may be some personalities and some types, and where you live, and what part of the church you're in or whatever, where maybe that path looks different for you, and maybe it doesn't lead you out of the church. And I think you and I both respect those trajectories, is that there are other valid ways to do it. But that's right, is for us, I think, and from what I hear you saying also, is this was a spiritual progression, is what it felt like. Spiritual, not just an intellectual thing. It was hitting a point of, for me, what it felt like of being humble enough and to genuinely consider that I might be wrong, and of course, saying that you're humble enough, that's the most prideful thing you can say, of course, and so, yeah, it is what it is, like anybody who knows me, there's plenty of ego there. But yeah, it felt like a progression and not a falling away. And that's what, when you talk about, that you used that phrase early on, and I was just reflecting on that. And that's, I think, part of the job, part of the task of like building unity, is finding ways to even reframe some of these things. Like, have we really fallen away, or are we just in a different place and exploring new territory? And, and that's what, and living satisfying spiritual lives of joy. And that's, I think, one of, at this point, we've lived long enough to know that, in my opinion, like, happiness is not something that happens to you. And it's really not even, it doesn't even make a great goal in life. If you live a good life and you're doing the things that cultivate happiness, then you will experience that joy. And that's just, and it is some of those basic, it's the core principles that you learn in the church, which aren't unique to the church. They're not the only, those principles, they transcend the Latter-day Saint faith, even though they are taught beautifully within the faith also. And that's just, it's looking outside of yourself. It's trying to reflect on what you're doing, trying to help be inclusive and share love with others. So, yeah.
Cool. Maybe. So I think we never actually mentioned, but so you did resign from the church. When did you do that?
Yeah, so I resigned in January of 2016. And so this was a while after, so a year and 3/4 after kind of my faith transition that happened mentally. I was still, there was a lot of, it was very difficult. Like those early stages are really tough, because everything's in the air, and you don't know where things are going to kind of fall out. And so you're having discussions with, in my case, like with my wife, and she was a little bit reluctant to have these conversations, in part because we had just experienced a death in the family. And so she was like, is there any way that we can put this on the back burner for a little while? I don't really want to deal with this right now. This is super heavy. And unfortunately, I was not able to really do that. It was just such a driving life. The need for congruity in your worldview is so powerful that I just, at this point, I was trying to restructure everything, and they call it a deconstruction phase and stuff. And so just reading vociferously, just everything you could to read to really understand, is this a better model? And but my wife, fortunately, I think for me, and everybody has different paths, but she had actually, I think, developed a nuanced faith, despite me even being, which I was not really aware of. And so after I had transitioned, it wasn't, it was really just a few conversations. And she was like, yeah, this, I think there's really good reasons to doubt the core truth claims. And she had held those for a long time. She had issues with the aspects of the temple ceremony, issues with Joseph Smith's polygamy. She had studied that a lot in depth in college. And then she had recently been studying a whole bunch of things about the priesthood. And she had so she was very well, very informed. And then she had issues with LGBT things and Prop 8. And she didn't feel that those were right. In fact, she, even as a member, she felt like the church's stance on Prop 8 and their stance with marriage was incorrect, was wrong and faulty. And I made space for her to have that belief. I didn't really hold that. I had studied it out and I was like, well, I think the church is on the right path here. But anyway, needless to say, she was more nuanced than I had imagined in many ways. And so we were able to more or less make the transition simultaneously, as a little bit of a seesaw, or, one ahead of the other. But but then we were doing calling. So I was a ward clerk, and and she was in primary. And so we essentially did our callings, and she also just wanted to, hey, let's not move fast. And so we took our time at it. And then by the time we were kind of ready to go, it was tithing season. And so Melissa was like, well, maybe it's just best to finish off the year so you don't leave the bishopric in a bind. And so, so we finished, I finished off the year and then resigned formally.
Mm-hmm. And so she did about the same time. Did she resign?
No. So she did not resign. None of my children have actually formally resigned. So, so there's some family dynamics there, her parents are, have been involved in some high leadership positions and things like that. And so I think that's just not something that she doesn't want to kind of ruffle those feathers. And
she's still a member of the church.
So she's technically still a member. And then as well, I think she's also, she takes a very holistic view of the church and religion and God and those types of things as well. And she doesn't really like people putting her in a hole. And so in some ways, by not resigning as well, that kind of, it's like, well, she is technically still a member too. So you can't kind of put her in that hole. For me, it was just my family had been so black and white, and I had been so devout that it just wasn't tenable for me to remain a member. And I had moral objections to aspects of the church, and on those grounds, I felt like I needed to resign to be consistent with my own sense of inner morality, and to also to just kind of put I don't know what you want to say, draw a line in the sand, or just make this is. I believe this. I'm very confident in my position. I'm always open to revising it, but at the same point is this is a thing. This is not. And if I were to come back to the church, it would need to be like a full reconversion and a whole different experience. So I was very comfortable resigning. And I would do it again. It's one of those things that I would resign again if I had the opportunity.
All right. So so it's been almost 5 years since you resigned. But first question is, so what kind of involvement does your family then still have with the church? Like, do you do churchy things at home, or does any of you, do any of them attend church? And
no. So everybody, like our second son, he wanted to attend a little bit more, and so we would go to church with him for some time. But no, essentially everybody, as we talk through it, and I try not to impose my personal view on other people, including my children. Like, I just want them to be able to believe how they want. But once you're exposed to some of those data points at all, then it becomes very easy to believe in a naturalistic worldview. And so, as far as all my children adopted that kind of a naturalistic worldview. They're all good people, good moral children. They're all spiritual, and in some sense. But yeah, in terms of practices, my wife, I wanted to find a new church potentially, or look around, and then my wife, at various times, she also has wanted to do that. But she also said, look, we've been doing the church so vigorously for so long. I mean, so committed. And she's like, well, what would life look like if it were slightly less structured? What might evolve out of that, of a less structured life? And so I was willing to kind of try the experiment. And so really of just living with a little less structure. And there are aspects of that have been really beautiful and interesting, right? Like, so, what happens when there's not an activity that you have to go to or talk to prepare, and so you get different types of things, and we've then kind of layered in structure over time as we've needed it. So we make sure to eat together some nights. As an example, we have started skiing as a family. That we picked that up a few years ago, and so we do that Sunday morning. That's family time. We'll all go together. You're riding the lifts together. You're in the car together, and
it's pretty empty there in Utah on Sunday morning, right?
Yeah, well, it's getting more and more filled, but right. Currently, I think there's a lot of people going through faith transitions, and so it's not as empty as we would like, but it's much better than Saturdays. Saturdays are really, really busy. But so some of those types of things have been so we comment to ourselves that, like, skiing together as a family has been very rewarding and very rich. And so when you think about a typical church experience, and I know it hasn't been typical for a long time with COVID for most people, I think, but a typical church experience, you don't necessarily, our church was really close. So you'd, drive to church for 2 minutes, and then you can't talk during sacrament meeting, and then you don't see anybody during the other meetings because everybody goes their separate ways. And so, just skiing together as a family has been a great family experience. And I would say in our case, maybe building more family unity than going, attending church together. And then also because I know we don't have like a structured religious instruction, then we do spend a lot of time just kind of talking about morality and philosophy and politics and these types of things. So what naturally emerges is just kind of a robust and interesting intellectual and spiritual dialogue with each other and as a family. And so it's much more organic, I think. And I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that it's superior to other ways of being or other structures, but it has, I think it's been, it's worked, and, and so there are aspects, I was going to say, there are aspects of, changing faith or having a faith transition in Utah is challenging. There are aspects of it that are challenging for the children. Different ones maybe lost some friendships and things as a result. There's some levels of shunning with some people. At the same time, there's just tons of super warm. Some of my children are friends with all LDS children. some of my children are friends with all non-LDS children, they've just, and some of them, they were friends with non-LDS children before they realized that, before we had our faith transition. So there's just a lot of variety there. But, Utah, there's a lot of variety in types of Mormons and things like that. But in general, there's just, there's a lot of wonderful people, and we've considered moving away from Utah, but we just think that this, we like the people, and we like the outdoors, and we love, and the culture is one that we appreciate the good things, and we understand the things that are not so good, and the devil is sometimes better than the devil you don't, or whatever. And so it's so we've stuck around in Utah, even though with my work, the type of work I do, we could easily move someplace else. But we do enjoy it here, and we enjoy being around family, and
Sure.
There's a lot of good and friends and family. So
how would you personally describe your beliefs about God, religion right now? Anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've spent a lot of time on it. And I would say for me, the important things are, to me, I think a belief in God is, the way I view it is, it's a distraction to what are more important issues. So as it stands, nobody, as far as I can tell, has a great grasp on the existence of God. And again, earlier we had talked about, there are people who do claim to have spoken with Jesus. And I think I don't think it's worth getting into right now. I think there are issues with the objectivity of those experiences. Like they may not actually be objectively real. And I think there's some good reasons to be concerned about that. And so anyway, the point is there's at least some reason to doubt that there is a God. And so the things that are important, in my opinion, are the things that we can establish with some confidence. And so God is kind of a distraction. The real question is, are we going to be good, in my opinion, and are we going to try and find truth? And so those are, and are we going to try and live a productive, creative life? Those are the questions that are most important, because it's just there. The God question is, there's too many variables and there's too many unknowns, and it's very difficult to say. And so I guess I believe in, we need to have good models of truth, and having a good model is a moral thing. So it's not, we allocate resources and we take action based on how good our model, based on the models that we have. And if our models are wrong, then our actions are going to potentially harm people in ways that we didn't want or anticipate, or we would fail to help people in the most important ways. So I guess that I really believe in the importance of getting our models right, or in having them as close to right as possible. And models, in some sense, are never complete. Are never even fully accurate. They're just useful to some degree, but you can kind of measure that usefulness as a scientist. That's one of the things you do, is you're always interrogating your models for their accuracy. And then I think, I believe strongly in the principles of agency. And of course, there's a lot of philosophical debate about, is agency a real thing? And there's determinism and compatibilism, and there's a lot of philosophical debates along these lines. And I think, to some extent, as a biologist, as a scientist, I think some of these conclusions are a little premature about what free will and how that works biologically. And as far as I can tell, it seems that we have free will. And insofar as it seems that we have that free will, it seems to me that it's important to use it well and try and help others and to live a good life. So those are those are the things that I believe kind of strongly, and those sound more metaphysical and philosophical than they do about religion. I think I don't. So at this point, I believe strongly in the naturalist frameworks, which means I'm skeptical of the supernatural claims. I'm happy to investigate them and probe them and interrogate them and ask, how well do they stand up to scrutiny? So it's not that I've closed myself off to those possibilities, but I think the data don't support the supernatural claims very well at this point.
So, yeah, I hear you on that. Actually, on the naturalism, I think what I would express it as is that we don't have good evidence for, or let's say, I don't know, good scientific evidence for in a scientific in the scientific method manner about being able to prove that God was involved in some kind of a natural or something that occurred or something that I totally agree with. I think though that for the point and purpose of existence as such, that anything even exists, I think that for that to be for that to have some kind of reason, purpose, and meaning, I think there is where I see God having a good chance because the way I look at it is that I don't feel the need to be able to prove that God is a Mormon God or that God is a Christian God or whatever, that there is that someone holds the truth about God. I have no need for that at all. But what I do feel just sincerely, kind of like as an intuition, or I would also say rational, is that if this prime, if you take away this prime source, whatever, for existence, or bringing it all into existence, and consciousness, and I would say that without some kind of God, whatever it is, that it would seem sort of pointless. I mean, obviously, you could naturalistically, you could argue that the fact that that there seems to be some purpose and that there seems to be some direction in whatever the evolution of the universe, and that it could all be random, right? Or that there is a multiverse and that ours just randomly happened to be one where we can see some kind of, let's say, even consciousness emerging and stuff.
Yeah.
But this is where I see that that God still has a pretty good stand.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that there are aspects of the universe that I think give me hope in the idea of a God. It's not my personal philosophy doesn't happiness hinge on the existence of God, but I agree that the existence of consciousness in the universe, the complexity of life, the size and complexity of the universe, these are all things that I think give us indirect hope that maybe that a God exists, and I agree that to some extent it can be helpful to think about things having greater meaning if God exists and or our consciousness persists eternally. My personal feeling, though, is that it's one of those things that why does it matter on some sense if a God exists or if our consciousness persists eternally for things to have meaning? And so I think what I've done to deal with these issues is to say, look, there's intrinsic meaning right now in our conscious experience. And the meaning is the meaning that we share with one another. We're clearly we're communicating consciously, conscious beings, at least it appears that way. And it seems the most reasonable, straightforward conclusion that we're having, that we're sharing thoughts with one another across time and space. And that's great. And so there's meaning there. And so why do I have to, as an example, why do I have to live forever? Or why do I rely on a third party? Why does God need to be involved in the meaning-making experience? We're making meaning right now, and it's intrinsic, and it doesn't matter. So it may be that we cease to exist when we die biologically, That's one, very possible conclusion to this life. But in terms of, we say, oh, well, then it doesn't matter. But my counter argument to that is, well, why does it matter if we live eternally? Why does any individual instant matter anyway? So it's like, well, just because you're going to live forever, the meaning, if there's meaning, it is intrinsic. And so I think the duration of time and the involvement of a third party in that exchange of meaning, or the creation of meaning and or joy and or happiness and or purpose, is actually, and that's the way, is a distraction to the intrinsic nature of meaning and purpose and joy. And those things, if they exist to some extent, they have to exist intrinsically.
Yeah, I understand that. And I would even say that the meaning is not, to me personally, I mean, obviously my meaning is anyway made in this life. I mean, I don't know what happens after that. Yeah. And so that is absolutely, that I agree 100% that whatever the meaning you find, it is, tied to this life, this experience. I am just saying that it's just my opinion. My opinion is that existence as such, in my opinion, should have some kind of a purpose because otherwise, and it doesn't have to be related to even my person. I mean, if my person doesn't continue, I mean, we could say that that's fine too, although I'd like to live forever. But let's say that no individual physical instances of intelligence will be able to live forever. But, for the creation of existence as such, I feel that there should be some kind of a bigger purpose, why is there even something in existence if there's no, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, yep.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Our intuition wants to point us in that direction. That there is some greater purpose. I think you're right, and it is compelling, and it also provides an additional scaffold for layering on that meaning and hoping that it persists, somehow in some way. And it is amplified, beyond our current scope, which is fairly narrow. I totally agree with those things.
But this is just an intellectual argument. I mean, my happiness actually doesn't. I mean, I don't rest my happiness on it.
Right, and that's I agree, and that's the and I guess that's kind of why when I say I think the whole conversation of God, it's so central to. Say a Latter-day Saints view of the world, right? Like God is the focus of so much of their thought and effort and time in prayer and meditation and scripture reading, and they're thinking about God and trying to have this relationship. And my personal feeling is that I prayed so very sincerely for decades, and have spent hours, so. Probably, cumulatively days or weeks of my life in prayer. And at this point, I interpret those conversations as personal conversations within my own consciousness. I guess that's right. Once you transition out, it just seems like there's enough intrinsically to deal with in terms of your focus and your happiness and your joy, that God, for me at this point, the whole idea and the discussion is kind of a distraction, because that's where I sit right now, is just that if these things have purpose, if we have meaning, there needs to be some intrinsic meaning, no matter what, God or no God. We should focus on what's that intrinsic, and it's not necessarily in a hedonistic way. So the purpose of life is not necessarily not at least exclusively just for our own personal pleasure, but it is in challenging ourselves in being inclusive and creating relationships. It's all these things that, you know, make life worth living. It's more than just, say, base pleasure that I think is the fear. You know, those who are spiritual and believe in God, the fear is that if you stop believing in God and you leave the church, then you become you know, you would I don't know, become a porn addicted drug addict, and just immediately, right? Like, because why else? What else would you do with your time? If you know, or you would immediately just do things as inherently pleasurable as possible with no regard for anybody else. And I just that just seems like a really short-sighted way to approach life.
Yeah. Okay. I know you want to probably get going, but one more question I have for you. Well, first of all, I will start this by saying that one of the people I interviewed, Jared Anderson, described himself as, I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he said he's, you know, his priority is well-being, but he is an agnostic. So he said he doesn't consider himself atheist, but he's agnostic. Would you consider yourself something like this also? Well-being is important for, you know?
Yeah, that's a I would say for me, that's a totally acceptable way of, I would describe myself in those terms. The agnostic part, you know, like, so people get into really technical debates about the proper terminology to use in terms of your belief. And for me, I think the easiest way to approach, so I'm not a fan of, so because the labels mean different things to different people, I'm a little hesitant to even use the labels because they'll be misconstrued probably. Mm-hmm. I think the easiest way to approach, like, say, my belief in God is the Spectrum of Theistic Probability by Richard Dawkins. I think he first formulated it, or at least formalized it. And it's basically saying that I think it's unlikely that there is a God based on the evidence that I've been presented this far in my life. And I live as if there is no God, but I'm not, you know, I'm not 100% confident that there is no God. And so that, I think that lack of 100% confidence to some extent would put me in an agnostic camp. But then atheism to some extent is just saying you're, you know, people often comment like an atheist just believes in one fewer God than you do. Is we already, you know, we're atheistic about the Roman gods and the Greek gods, and you know, as Christians from the West, we're atheistic about the Hindu gods, and we're atheistic about the paganistic gods and gods of nature and things like that. We're you know, but it doesn't mean that we're actively fighting against those ideas or antagonistic to those ideas. It's just they are not compelling to us. And so I don't mind being called an atheist. I don't mind being called an agnostic. And I think all of those.
Would you mind being called a tentative theist?
Sure. Like, I would be a tentative theist is fine with me, because I'm not opposed to the idea, like, intellectually necessarily. And I think there's some evidence that suggests and points towards a God. I don't think it's necessarily the best conclusion. But yeah, so I think the way I prefer to label myself, and this is my point about kind of it being a distraction, is I prefer to label myself as a moral realist, meaning that I believe there are moral propositions that are reflective of our actual reality, and I believe that they should, you know, the well-being of ourselves and others should guide our actions. Like, we should care about how other people experience this universe. And so it's not, so to me, like, if you want to label me, you miss what I care about and what I'm focused on if you label me an agnostic or an atheist or any of that, because I don't see myself in those light. Like, I'm not worried about those issues. Like, maybe there'll be more data. To some extent, these are underdetermined. So there's, in mathematics, you can look at different systems of equations and, like, how do you solve certain equations? And so the data in God, the data set is underdetermined. It means that we don't have enough data to say definitively. And I guess in that sense, that makes me an agnostic, but neither does the data, it's not enough to say there is no God. It's not enough to say there is a God, in my opinion. And so, but so it's just, so why, and the question is, why is that question so important? Like, so when we approach another person, why, and as a member, I did this all the time. Now I don't, but it's like, why does it matter so much what somebody believes about this third party who we all agree on some level we aren't completely sure about, right? Like, it's at least inconclusive. So why is our belief in this inconclusive being the way that we interface with one another? Like, why is
Let me tell you why. I have the answer for you, John.
Okay, all
right. because at certain times, developmental stages in your life, the external authority can be very motivational. I think you and I both realize the historical place in belief in God being the basis of, developing morality in societies, and let's say setting the standards. If God said it, that this should be done in this way, I mean, it builds a very strong motivation. And I mean, I've been very blessed. Like, I have to say that, like, there have been times that's so hard in my life that I would have probably, if I didn't believe that God said I shouldn't drink alcohol, because of my family history, what I've seen growing up, I probably would have started drinking alcohol, maybe become a drunkard. Maybe in the first few rough years in my marriage, I would have, if I didn't believe that, marriage was instituted of God, maybe I would have said, hey, it's too tough, let's split and we'll both find someone else.
Yeah.
Which would have been a huge mistake, because now I'm so thankful that I'm still married to this person.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think we cannot underestimate the motivational value.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a good point. And you're right, developmentally and for societies and certain frameworks, I think you're absolutely right. It ends up being very important. It ends up being an organizing principle and establishing that, like, authority, and so that people don't have to question that. I do think that to some extent as a society, we're beginning to transcend that authority. It seems, generally we almost always appeal to the scientific studies in terms of our morality at this point. I mean, that's really what happened with the homosexual debate, was really something that happened in that fashion, is that, early on, it was, religiously, this was frowned upon. And then eventually the social scientists and the scientists, they said, I recently went back and studied this data, but, you can still make the argument that scientifically, you really can't say normatively, like, that this is a good thing or even acceptable or normal. All you can say is that it happens among humans, and that it's not correlated with other psychological markers that are, detrimental to well-being. Like, that's kind of the most you can say. And yet, but essentially the scientific consensus has been enough that even in the LDS view, even though we have all these scriptures, we've essentially accepted that scientific consensus that homosexuality is a normal, is not an abnormal way of being. And so I guess that's the sort of thing I would point to, is that this is what we're seeing now is a prelude to, I think, more of that, is just the ability, science has become the authority, and obviously it can't become the final moral authority. So there's a lot of philosophical debate along these lines, is, it obviously can't dictate our final sense of morality, but ultimately morality is about well-being. And if we're going to generalize it then it has to include others. And so as soon as you do that, then we're all in this process of sifting out together what are the best ways to live together and build a productive society. And and so I think we've ultimately, as a society, we've already ceded authority to the scientific enterprise. Like another good example of that is with DNA in the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon used to begin with the statement, that the Lamanites and Nephites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians, and science, the DNA doesn't show that anymore. And the religion concedes anywhere the science is clearly established. So,
Okay, final question. How do you define spirituality, and do you practice spirituality in your life, and how?
Yeah, that's it's just such a great question. I'm just gonna pull.
I saved the best for last, John.
Yeah. There's
because you have mentioned it here and there when we've talked. You've talked about you've mentioned spirituality. Yeah.
So, I think, to me, I define spirituality as it's the process of feeling connected with others and with a greater sense of purpose. I think, it's part of. So it's just that awareness that you're not alone, and that you can appreciate on some level and imperfectly, but just the way other people are experiencing the universe. And so to me, spirituality is kind of going outside of yourself a little bit, and it's that process of reflecting across time and space, and just appreciating where you're at, and enjoying and just appreciating the opportunity to live, So life is kind of a blessing, regardless of its source. We are here for the most part. For most of us, it's a positive experience most of the time, or some of the time. And those who don't experience it that way, hopefully we can help them. And that's the, and make it better. Let's see. So there's a fellow on the Mormon. He's on the Mormon subreddit, and his handle is Gilerio Deckel or Deckel. It's really hard to pronounce, but he wrote a document called "The Sources of Revelation," and he basically generalized it. And he said, "Look, these are, we think about revelation, and this is closely related to spirituality, and so this is where I'm going with this, but." But we think about these in terms of LDS tools and ways of doing it, but there's secular versions of all of these. So there's personal revelation, and this is, a secular humanist views the process of consciously and subconsciously engaging with our existence and what's right and what's good and what's beautiful. Like all of that is part of this personal revelation. It's learning from great teachers. So people, we've had all these people that have gone before us. They're all, and the Dalai Lama, and they all have their issues too. Nobody's perfect in this way, but there's these these spiritual leaders, and a lot of them are Latter-day Saints, right? So Latter-day Saints have been very influential to me. We have our community that is a source of revelation. As we talk and discuss ideas, we are motivated, and we understand things differently by being a community. And then we have our scripture. And so for a Latter-day Saint, there's a canon, there's canonical scripture, but like, what is scripture to a secular humanist? And the scripture is really, it's anything that we care about almost. And it's anything that like speaks deeply to us. And so I would argue that there's all kinds of scripture today. And it's like, as an example, there's the series Avatar: The Last Airbender. And it's it's an anime cartoon type series. And yet it grapples with very deep questions of morality and existence and behavior and friendship and all these types of things. And so to me, that is a form of scripture. And I think there's other forms of scripture, and it speaks to the truths of our existence. And then, we also have different rituals. And so, now my rituals aren't the same. So I don't, I don't pray because it doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't make any sense to my worldview anymore, but I do sit quietly, and I do enjoy being in nature. And I enjoy just really meditating deeply on problems, and and thinking about my family and loved ones and friends. And those are all things that that helped me, find that spirituality. And so, so my spirituality does look fairly different in many ways, but then there's a lot of core pieces that are the same. And I do struggle with that some, because you're so familiar with one way of being spiritual. There's a very rigid way of doing spirituality in the LDS faith, and it's good. There's a lot of aspects to it that are fantastic, and so in part it's been challenging, but also invigorating to explore different ways of connecting and meditating and things like that.
Okay, John, thank you very much. It's been an awesome interview. I've learned a lot. With every person I talk to, I learn something new. There will always be at least one or two things that I will remember for a long time, and it's been this.
And likewise, it's been just super fascinating to get your perspective, both on air and off air. We had some conversations as well, and it's just so great to hear your perspective. And I just hope that everything goes well for you and your spiritual journey, and you and your family and loved ones too.
Thank you very much. And I will also mention that just quickly, because I forgot to do it in the beginning, that I got to know John through a common Facebook contact we have, Jackson Washburn. He's an active LDS member and believing Mormon. But he has a big, large circle of contacts, and there was some discussion once about something, and I saw John's comment there, and I thought it was just brilliant, and that's how we contacted through Facebook. And John, you also have an extensive blog, which I will link to. I cannot pronounce it, Fain Rendi or something.
Yeah. Yep, it's a careful examination is kind of the name of the blog, but that's right. I host it right now on GitHub, and so that's the username that I'm using. My parents initially were sensitive about me posting things under my real name, and I don't think that they would feel the same way at this point in time. But so it's under Fain Randy. You'll have to look at the link, but if you type in a careful examination and LDS, it'll probably be one of the top hits. And so I've written on a lot of different topics, and it might be out.
It's extensive. Okay, thank you very much, John. Take care.
Thank you, Kenneth. It was great talking.
Bye-bye.